The alien empress could control every mind until a human soldier made her heart race. For centuries, Empress Selene ruled her empire with absolute control. Every thought, every secret, every betrayal laid bare before her all-seeing mind. No one could lie, no one could hide. Yet when a lone human soldier, battered and defiant, stood before her throne, something happened she never expected. His thoughts chaotic, wild, unpredictable, and somehow unreadable. For the first time in her reign, she couldn't break into someone's mind. And even worse, every word, every glance, made her pulse quicken in ways that no power ever had. But was this mysterious human a threat? Or something far more dangerous? A temptation? Before we dive deeper into this story of forbidden power and unexpected romance among the stars, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss more epic HFY stories like this one. Your support keeps this channel flying beyond the stars. Kellan ducked behind a crumbling wall, the air thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. His pulse hammered in his ears as he reloaded his rifle, the last of his ammo clicking into place. Around him, the screams of his squad pierced the chaos. Friends he'd fought beside for years, now falling one by one. The enemy moved like shadows, too fast, too precise, their weapons humming with an eerie, alien glow. He fired off a burst, grinning despite the sweat stinging his eyes. "If I'm going down," he muttered to himself, "at least I'll look damn cool doing it." A blast tore through the wall beside him, showering him with debris. He rolled to the side, his boots skidding on the dirt, and caught a glimpse of Jackson, his second in command, crumpling under a hail of energy bolts. Kellan cursed under his breath, his chest tightening. No time to mourn. He sprang up, aiming for the nearest shadow, but something slammed into his back hard. Pain exploded through his ribs, and his vision blurred as he hit the ground, the rifle slipping from his hands. Boots crunched closer, and he forced his head up, squinting through the haze. Figures loomed over him, their silhouettes sharp against the flickering sky. One of them raised a device, and a jolt of electricity surged through his body. His muscles locked, his jaw clenched, and he fought to keep his eyes open. "Well, shit," he rasped, his voice barely a croak. "Guess I'm not dying today." The world tilted as they dragged him upright, his arms pinned behind him. He caught the glint of a strange insignia on their armor. Nothing human about it. His legs wobbled, but he forced a smirk, spitting blood onto the dirt. "You guys throw one hell of a party," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. One of the figures tilted its head, as if puzzled, but didn't respond. They hauled him toward a sleek, hovering craft parked beyond the battlefield, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. Kellan's head throbbed, his body screaming with every step, but he kept his eyes sharp, scanning for any chance to break free. The ramp lowered with a hiss, and they shoved him inside, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. He stumbled, catching himself against the wall, and the door sealed shut behind him. The hum of engines vibrated through the floor as the craft lifted off, carrying him away from the only life he'd ever known. Kellan woke to a dull ache pulsing through his skull, his wrists bound tight against a chair. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering light of the room. The walls gleamed with a strange, metallic sheen, reflecting his battered reflection back at him. The air felt cold, sterile, and a low rumble. Engines maybe thrummed beneath his feet. He shifted, testing the restraints, and winced as the cords bit into his skin. "Nice hospitality," he muttered, his voice hoarse. 5 stars for the decor, though." Footsteps echoed, sharp and deliberate, and he straightened as much as he could. A figure stepped into view, tall, commanding, draped in a flowing robe that hugged her form in all the right places. Empress Selene, though he didn't know her name yet, carried an air of icy authority, her pale eyes locking onto him with unnerving intensity. Her beauty hit him like a punch, sharp cheekbones, full lips, and a presence that made the room feel smaller. He swallowed, forcing his usual grin. "Didn't expect the welcome committee to be this pretty," he said, leaning back as if he weren't tied up. She didn't respond, just tilted her head, studying him. Then she stepped closer, too close. He could feel the heat radiating off her, a stark contrast to the chill of the room. Her scent, something sharp and intoxicating, filled his lungs, and his pulse quickened. She reached out, her fingers brushing his chest as she began to undo the restraints, her touch slow, deliberate, like she was testing him. The contact sent a jolt through him, and he clenched his fists, fighting the heat creeping up his neck. Her skin grazed his, soft but firm, and he couldn't tell if it was accidental or on purpose. "What are you planning to do with me?" he asked, his voice dropping low, rougher than he intended. "Because I'm not sure I'll play nice." She paused, her hand lingering just above his collarbone, and he caught a flicker of something in her eyes, curiosity, maybe even amusement. She pulled back, stepping away, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Selene circled him now, her gaze piercing, like she was trying to peel back his thoughts. He felt a strange pressure in his mind, a tugging sensation, but it faded as quickly as it came. Her brow furrowed, and he smirked. "What's wrong? Can't crack the code?" he teased, shifting in the chair. She stopped in front of him, her lips parting slightly, and he wondered what it'd be like to close the distance between them. The room's lights pulsed faintly, casting shadows across her face, and he took in the details, the way her robe clung to her hips, the faint shimmer of her hair. She said something in a language he didn't understand, her voice smooth and commanding, and two guards stepped forward from the corners. Kellan tensed, but they didn't touch him yet. Selene's eyes stayed on him, unreadable, and he felt the weight of her attention like a physical thing. She turned, her robe swishing softly, and headed toward a door that slid open with a hiss. The guards moved closer, their hands gripping his arms, and he braced himself as they pulled him to his feet. Kellan's boots echoed on the polished floor as the guards shoved him into a new chamber, this one a stark contrast to the cold cell he'd woken up in. The room stretched wide, its walls lined with sleek panels that glowed faintly, casting a warm light over everything. A long table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs that looked more like thrones, and at the far end stood Empress Selene, her back to him. She turned as he entered, her robe swirling around her like liquid shadow, and Kellan's breath caught for a second. The way the fabric hugged her figure was almost unfair. Every curve, every line, screaming power and something else he couldn't quite name yet. The guards released his arms, and he rubbed his wrists, forcing a grin despite the ache in his bones. "Fancy place," he said, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Guess I'm moving up in the world." Selene didn't smile, just watched him with those piercing eyes, like she was trying to unravel him piece by piece. She gestured to a chair, and he sauntered over, dropping into it with a casual sprawl, legs kicked out in front of him. "So what's this about? You gonna interrogate me, or just stare me to death?" She stepped closer, her movements smooth, deliberate, and Kellan felt the air shift as she approached. "You're different," she said, her voice low and melodic, cutting through the silence like a blade. He tilted his head, smirking. "Yeah, I get that a lot. Probably because my head's a mess even I can't figure out. Good luck digging in there." Her lips twitched, just a flicker, and he wondered if he'd imagined it. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the table, and he caught the faint scent of her again, sharp, intoxicating, pulling at something deep in his gut. Her eyes narrowed, and that tugging sensation hit his mind again, sharper this time, like fingers brushing against his thoughts. He clenched his jaw, pushing back instinctively, and the pressure faded. Selene straightened, her brow creasing, and he couldn't help but laugh. "What's the matter? Can't crack me open?" he teased, leaning forward to mirror her. "Don't feel bad. Smarter people than you have tried and failed." She didn't answer, just circled the table, her robe brushing the floor with a soft whisper. Kellan tracked her every move, his pulse picking up as she stopped beside him. Too close again. The heat of her body radiated through the thin space between them, and he could see the way her chest rose and fell under that damn robe. Slow, controlled, but enough to make his thoughts scatter. She reached out, her fingers hovering near his temple, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. "You're hiding something," she murmured, her voice sliding over him like silk. He couldn't stop himself. His hand shot up, catching her hip as she leaned in, his fingers pressing into the soft curve beneath the fabric. She froze, her breath hitching, and he felt the warmth of her through the thin material, firm yet yielding under his grip. His heart slammed against his ribs, and he slid his thumb along her side, testing her reaction. "You can't read me," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper as he leaned closer, his lips brushing her ear. "But I bet you're dying to try something else." Selene didn't pull away, but her eyes flared, a mix of surprise and something darker, something that made the air between them crackle. Her lips parted, just enough for him to notice, and he felt the heat of his own breath rebounding off her skin. His hand tightened on her hip, pulling her fraction closer, and for a moment he swore she leaned into it. The tension coiled tight in his chest, a raw, hungry edge he hadn't expected, and he wondered how far he could push this before one of them broke. She stepped back, breaking the contact, and he let his hand drop, though the feel of her lingered on his fingertips. "You're bold," she said, her tone cool, but laced with a curiosity that hadn't been there before. He grinned, leaning back in the chair, his blood still humming. "You have no idea," he shot back, crossing his arms. "Stick around. I'm full of surprises." Selene turned away, her posture stiffening, but he caught the way her fingers flexed at her sides, like she was fighting something. She moved to a panel on the wall, tapping it with a quick, precise motion, and a holographic display flickered to life. Maps, symbols, things he didn't recognize. "You're a prisoner here," she said, not looking at him. "But you're not like the others. That makes you interesting." "Interesting, huh?" He stretched, letting his voice dip into a playful drawl. "I'll take that as a compliment." She glanced over her shoulder, her gaze locking with his again, and he felt that pull, sharp, undeniable, like a current running straight through him. Neither of them spoke for a beat, the silence heavy with unspoken things, and he wondered what she saw when she looked at him. She turned back to the display, her fingers tracing the glowing lines, and Kellan shifted in his seat, his eyes drifting to the way her robe clung to her as she moved. The guard stood silent at the edges of the room, but he barely noticed them anymore. His mind was too busy replaying the feel of her under his hand, the way she'd reacted, and he couldn't shake the thought of what might happen if he got her alone again. Kellan slouched against the wall of the observation chamber, arms crossed, watching Selene pace the room like a predator sizing up its prey. The space was smaller than the last, its curved walls pulsing with faint blue light, and the air carried that same sharp, intoxicating scent he'd come to associate with her. She'd summoned him again, her guards shoving him in without a word, and now she stood there, her robe clinging to her like a second skin, every step accentuating the sway of her hips. He smirked, letting his eyes linger. "Back for more, huh?" he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Guess I'm harder to figure out than you thought." Selene stopped, turning to face him, her pale eyes glinting with frustration. "Your mind resists me," she said, her tone clipped but edged with something deeper, curiosity, maybe even obsession. She stepped closer, and Kellan straightened, his pulse kicking up a notch. "Let's try again," she added, raising a hand toward him. He felt that familiar tug in his head, a probing pressure, but he pushed back with a flood of nonsense. Random images of battles, bad jokes, anything to throw her off. Her brow furrowed, and he chuckled. "Good luck sorting through that mess," he taunted, leaning forward. "I barely can." She didn't back off. Instead, she closed the distance, her hand pressing flat against his chest, right over his heart. The heat of her palms seared through his shirt, and his breath hitched as her fingers spread, firm and deliberate, like she could pull his thoughts out through his skin. He reacted on instinct, grabbing her wrist, his grip tight enough to feel the delicate bones beneath her alien flesh. "Not so fast," he growled, yanking her forward until her body crashed into his, her chest pressing against him, soft yet unyielding. The contact sent a jolt through him, raw and electric, and he could feel her heartbeat racing under that thin robe. Her eyes widened, but she didn't pull away, and Kellan took it as a challenge. He bent down, his lips hovering near her ear, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin against his breath. "You want to get inside my head?" he whispered, his voice dropping to a husky rasp. "Or is there somewhere else you'd rather explore?" His free hand slid to her waist, fingers digging into the curve just above her hip, the fabric bunching under his touch. He dragged his thumb along her side, slow and deliberate, savoring the way her body tensed, the subtle give of her flesh beneath his grip. She was all heat and power, and it lit something primal in him, a hunger he hadn't felt in years. Selene's breath came faster now, a sharp, uneven sound that fueled his pulse. Her eyes flickered, caught between confusion and a dark, unspoken want, and he felt her lean into him. Just a fraction, but enough to make his blood roar. His hand tightened on her waist, pulling her closer, and he could feel the press of her thighs against his, the thin barrier of her robe doing nothing to hide the shape of her. "You're not used to this, are you?" he murmured, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, the faintest graze of skin on skin. "Someone you can't control." Her fingers flexed against his chest, nails scraping lightly, and the sensation shot straight through him, tightening every muscle. She jerked back suddenly, breaking his hold, and he let her go, though his hands itched to pull her back. Her chest heaved, her lips parted, and he grinned, wiping a hand across his mouth as if he could still taste the tension in the air. "Keep trying, Empress," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Maybe you'll get lucky next time." She glared at him, but there was heat in it now, a spark that hadn't been there before. She turned away, her movements sharp, and crossed to a console on the far wall, her fingers tapping out commands with a little too much force. Kellan leaned back against the wall, his heart still pounding, watching the way her shoulders stiffened as she worked. He stood in the dimly lit chamber, the air heavier than usual, thick with a silence that pressed against his skin. Selene had dismissed the guards this time, leaving just the two of them in a space that felt too small, too intimate. She stood by a wide window, staring out at the endless void of space, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of distant stars. Her robe shimmered faintly, clinging to her like it was part of her, and Kellan's eyes traced the lines of her back, the way her hair spilled over her shoulders. He shifted his weight, the quiet gnawing at him. "You gonna keep me standing here all night?" he asked, his voice rough but softer than before. "Or is this the part where you finally admit you like having me around?" She turned, her movements slow, and those pale eyes locked onto him, sharp and unreadable. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a low bench against the wall. He raised an eyebrow, but complied, dropping onto it with a lazy sprawl, his legs stretched out. She didn't move closer, not yet, just watched him, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical touch. "Why do you resist me?" she asked, her tone quieter now, almost searching. He smirked, leaning back. "Maybe I just like watching you squirm when you can't figure me out." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she stepped forward, closing the gap between them. Kellan's pulse kicked up as she stopped just out of reach, her presence filling the room. "Tell me something true," she said, her voice low, cutting through the bravado he usually hid behind. He hesitated, the smirk fading, and for once he didn't dodge. "All right," he said, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I've been alone most of my life. Out there, fighting, running, never had anyone who stuck around long enough to matter. Gets old after a while." The words hung there, raw and unguarded, and he glanced up to see her expression shift, something softer, almost pained, flickering across her face. She moved closer, standing over him now, and he could feel the heat rolling off her, the faint hum of her energy brushing his senses. "I know that feeling," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ruling an empire. It isolates you in ways you can't imagine." He looked in her eyes, seeing a crack in that icy wall she always wore, and it hit him. They weren't so different after all. He stood, slow and deliberate, until he towered over her, the space between them shrinking to nothing. She didn't step back, and that was all the invitation he needed. His hands found her shoulders, sliding down her arms, feeling the smooth, alien warmth of her skin through the thin fabric. Then he moved behind her, his chest brushing her back, and his fingers traced a slow path from her shoulders down her spine, mapping the curve of her body with a touch that was both reverent and possessive. She stiffened, but didn't pull away, and he felt the tremor that ran through her under his hands. He leaned in, his breath hot against the nape of her neck, and slid his fingers lower, following the dip of her lower back to the swell of her hips. The robe was so thin he could feel every contour, every subtle shift of her flesh, and his grip tightened as he pulled her back against him, her body molding to his. "You ever want someone so bad you can't stand it?" he whispered, his voice a low growl, lips grazing the sensitive skin just below her ear. Her head tilted slightly, exposing more of her neck, and he pressed closer, his chest flush against her, the heat of her seeping into him until his blood felt like fire. Selene's hands reached up, clutching his shoulders, her nails digging in just enough to send a sharp thrill through him. She trembled, a soft, involuntary sound escaping her lips, and he could feel her pulse racing where his hands rested on her hips. His fingers dug deeper, sliding along the edge of her waist, teasing the line where fabric met skin and the tension between them thickened, heavy and suffocating. He wanted to spin her around, to taste that sound she'd made, but he held back, letting the ache build, letting it burn. She twisted in his grip, facing him now, her chest heaving as she stared up at him. Her hands stayed on his shoulders, anchoring her, and he could see the war in her eyes, desire clashing with something else, something heavier. "This complicates things," she said, her voice shaky but firm. He grinned, his hands still on her hips, thumbs brushing the soft plane of her stomach through the robe. "Good," he said, his tone rough with want. "I like complicated." She stepped back, breaking the contact, and he let her go, though his body screamed to pull her back. She crossed to the window again, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame, and he watched her, the memory of her heat still pulsing in his palms. He leaned against the bench, his breathing uneven, and the silence settled back in, thick with everything they hadn't said. Kellan paced the narrow corridor outside Selene's private quarters, the hum of the ship's engines a steady pulse beneath his boots. She called him here again, third time this week, and he could feel the shift in the air, the way their encounters had started to bleed past taunts and games into something heavier, something real. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and he stepped inside, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. Selene stood near a low table, her back to him, her robe a deep violet now, clinging to her like liquid night. He didn't say anything, just watched her, the silence stretching taut between them. She turned, her eyes catching his, and there was no ice in them this time, just a quiet intensity that made his chest tighten. "You're late," she said, her voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. He shrugged, stepping closer, his usual grin nowhere in sight. "Had to dodge a few guards. They're starting to look at me funny." She didn't laugh, but her lips curved slightly, and that was enough to pull him in further. He stopped a few feet away, hands shoved in his pockets, and let the words spill out, unguarded for once. "You keep bringing me back here." "Why?" Her gaze flickered, and she stepped toward him, closing the gap. "Because you're not like anyone else," she said, her tone raw, like she'd been holding it in too long. "You don't bow, you don't break. And I feel you, even when I can't see inside your head." Kellan swallowed, the weight of her words sinking in, and he saw it then, the loneliness in her, the same hollow ache he'd carried for years. He reached out, his hand brushing her arm, and she didn't pull away. The air shifted, charged with something unspoken, and he couldn't hold back anymore. He grabbed her waist, pulling her toward him with a firm tug, and she stumbled slightly, her hands landing on his chest. "Sit," he said, his voice low and rough, guiding her down onto his lap as he sank onto the edge of the table. She straddled his thighs, her weight settling against him, and his hands found her legs, fingers splaying over the smooth fabric of her robe. He slid them upward, slow and deliberate, feeling the heat of her skin seeping through, the way her muscles tensed under his touch. Her breath hitched, and he could feel her body warming, responding, the closeness driving his pulse into overdrive. He leaned in, his lips grazing the curve of her neck, the faint alien scent of her filling his lungs. Sharp, wild, addictive. "I could make you forget this whole damn empire," he whispered, his voice a gravelly promise, hot against her skin. His hands tightened on her thighs, thumbs pressing into the soft flesh just above her knees, and he dragged them higher, tracing the contours of her legs until the robe bunched under his grip. She shivered, a soft gasp escaping her, and he felt the tremor ripple through her, igniting something feral in him. His fingers dug in, possessive, savoring the way she yielded just enough to make his blood roar. Selene's hands slid up his chest, clutching his shoulders, and her nails bit into him, sharp and thrilling. He tilted his head, capturing her mouth in a kiss that hit like a storm, deep, hungry, all teeth and heat. Her lips parted under his, soft but fierce, and he pressed harder, tasting her, feeling her melt against him. His hands roamed higher, brushing the tops of her thighs, the thin fabric barely a barrier as he gripped her hips, pulling her tighter against him. The friction sent a jolt through him, raw and electric, and he groaned in her mouth, the sound swallowed by her own ragged breathing. She arched into him, her chest flush against his, and he could feel every curve, every pulse, driving him to the edge of control. He broke the kiss, pulling back just enough to breathe, his forehead resting against hers. Her eyes were dark, wild, and her lips were swollen, glistening from him, and it took everything not to dive back in. "You're trouble," he muttered, his voice thick, hands still locked on her hips, thumbs brushing the sensitive dip where her thighs met her waist. She didn't answer, just stared at him, her chest rising and falling fast, and he felt the ache of wanting her settled deep in his bones. She shifted, sliding off his lap, and he let her go, though his hands lingered, trailing down her legs as she stood. The air felt colder without her against him, and he leaned back on the table, watching as she crossed to a small cabinet in the corner. Her movements were unsteady, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out a decanter and 2 glasses. "Drink," she asked, her voice quieter now, but there was a roughness to it that hadn't been there before. He nodded, his eyes still fixed on her, the taste of her still burning on his lips as she poured the liquid with a faint clink. Kellan lay sprawled on the narrow cot in his quarters, the ship's hum a dull roar in his ears when the door slid open without warning. He sat up, muscles tensing, and saw Selene standing there, her silhouette sharp against the corridor's light. Her robe was looser tonight, a deep crimson that flowed over her like blood, and her face was tight, her eyes stormy with something he couldn't place. She stepped inside, the door sealing shut behind her, and the air thickened, heavy with the weight of her presence. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, testing the waters. She didn't answer, just crossed the room in quick, restless strides, stopping near the edge of his cot. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her tone clipped, but there was a tremor in it, a crack in her usual steel. He stood, closing the distance, and saw the way her hands clenched at her sides, like she was fighting herself. "Then why are you?" he pressed, his gaze locked on hers. She looked away, her jaw tightening, and he could feel the storm brewing in her, something big, something that could break them both. "I have a duty," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "This empire, it's mine to protect, to rule. But you—" She trailed off, her eyes flicking back to him, and he saw it then, the war between her heart and her crown. He didn't give her time to retreat. He stepped forward, pulling her into his arms, his hands sliding around her waist with a firm, unyielding grip. She stiffened, but he held her tighter, his fingers slipping under the edge of her robe, brushing the bare skin of her lower back. The contact was fire, smooth, warm, alien, and he dug his hands in, anchoring her against him like he could keep her there forever. Her breath caught, a sharp, ragged sound, and he bent down, his lips tracing the delicate line of her collarbone, feeling the pulse jump beneath her skin. "You could rule the whole damn galaxy," he murmured, his voice a deep rumble against her. "But I want you to be mine." His hands roamed higher, pressing into the curve of her spine, and he pulled her closer, her body molding to his, soft and fierce all at once. She trembled, her chest heaving against him, and he could feel the heat pouring off her, the way her hips pressed into his, igniting a hunger that clawed at his restraint. Selene's hands gripped his arms, her nails sinking in, and she leaned into him, her breath hot against his neck. "This is dangerous," she whispered, but her body told a different story. Every inch of her was alive under his touch, craving him as much as he craved her. His fingers slid lower, teasing the edge of her waist, and he nipped at her collarbone, a light graze of teeth that made her gasp. The sound shot through him, tightening his grip, and he pressed his lips harder against her skin, tasting the salt and the wildness of her. She arched into him, her curves fitting perfectly against his frame, and the tension between them burned, a wildfire he wasn't sure he could control. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes dark and conflicted, her lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He held her gaze, his hands still locked on her, thumbs brushing the bare skin under her robe, and the air pulsed with everything they weren't saying. "You don't have to choose yet," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But I'm not letting you go that easy." She nodded, a small, shaky movement, and stepped out of his arms, her fingers trailing down his chest as she moved. She turned toward the small viewport in the wall, staring out at the stars again, her shoulders rigid. Kellan watched her, his hands flexing at his sides, the feel of her still searing his palms as he leaned against the cot, waiting for her next move. Kellan lay sprawled on the narrow cot in his quarters, the ship's hum a dull roar in his ears, when the door slid open without warning. He sat up, muscles tensing, and saw Selene standing there, her silhouette sharp against the corridor's light. Her robe was looser tonight, a deep crimson that flowed over her like blood, and her face was tight, her eyes stormy with something he couldn't place. She stepped inside, the door sealing shut behind her, and the air thickened, heavy with the weight of her presence. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, testing the waters. She didn't answer, just crossed the room in quick, restless strides, stopping near the edge of his cot. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her tone clipped, but there was a tremor in it, a crack in her usual steel. He stood, closing the distance, and saw the way her hands clenched at her sides, like she was fighting herself. "Then why are you?" he pressed, his gaze locked on hers. She looked away, her jaw tightening, and he could feel the storm brewing in her, something big, something that could break them both. "I have a duty," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "This empire, it's mine to protect, to rule. But you—" She trailed off, her eyes flicking back to him, and he saw it then. The war between her heart and her crown. He didn't give her time to retreat. He stepped forward, pulling her into his arms, his hands sliding around her waist with a firm, unyielding grip. She stiffened, but he held her tighter, his fingers slipping under the edge of her robe, brushing the bare skin of her lower back. The contact was fire, smooth, warm, alien, and he dug his hands in, anchoring her against him like he could keep her there forever. Her breath caught, a sharp, ragged sound, and he bent down, his lips tracing the delicate line of her collarbone, feeling the pulse jump beneath her skin. "You could rule the whole damn galaxy," he murmured, his voice a deep rumble against her. "But I want you to be mine." His hands roamed higher, pressing into the curve of her spine, and he pulled her closer, her body molding to his, soft and fierce all at once. She trembled, her chest heaving against him, and he could feel the heat pouring off her, the way her hips pressed into his, igniting a hunger that clawed at his restraint. Selene's hands gripped his arms, her nails sinking in, and she leaned into him, her breath hot against his neck. "This is dangerous," she whispered, but her body told a different story. Every inch of her was alive under his touch, craving him as much as he craved her. His fingers slid lower, teasing the edge of her waist, and he nipped at her collarbone, a light graze of teeth that made her gasp. The sound shot through him, tightening his grip, and he pressed his lips harder against her skin, tasting the salt and the wildness of her. She arched into him, her curves fitting perfectly against his frame, and the tension between them burned, a wildfire he wasn't sure he could control. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes dark and conflicted, her lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He held her gaze, his hands still locked on her, thumbs brushing the bare skin under her robe, and the air pulsed with everything they weren't saying. "You don't have to choose yet," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But I'm not letting you go that easy." She nodded, a small, shaky movement, and stepped out of his arms, her fingers trailing down his chest as she moved. She turned toward the small viewport in the wall, staring out at the stars again, her shoulders rigid. Kellan watched her, his hands flexing at his sides, the feel of her still searing his palms as he leaned against the cot, waiting for her next move. Kellan stood in the armory, strapping a stolen alien blade to his thigh, the weight of it grounding him as the ship buzzed with tension. Word had spread fast. Selene's advisors, the stiff-necked conservatives, were moving against her, their murmurs of betrayal growing louder. They hated him, the human outsider, and the way she looked at him only fueled their fire. He'd overheard enough to know they were planning something big, something to tear her down and keep their precious empire pure. He tightened the strap, his jaw clenching. If they wanted to fight, he'd give them one, for her, for whatever this was between them. She found him there, slipping into the room like a shadow, her eyes sharp with worry. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice tight as she stepped closer. He turned, meeting her gaze, and saw the fear she was trying to hide. "Yeah, I do," he said, his tone hard. "They're coming for you, and I'm not sitting this out." She opened her mouth to argue, but he didn't let her finish. He grabbed her arm, pulling her into a shadowed corner of the armory, away from the flickering lights, and pinned her against the wall with a hand on her waist. Her breath hitched as he pressed himself closer, his grip tightening, fingers digging into the soft curve of her hip through the robe. He could feel her trembling, not from fear but from something else, something that mirrored the heat surging through him. He leaned in, his lips hovering over hers, close enough to taste her breath, and his voice dropped to a rough, husky growl. "If I make it back," he said, "you're going to pay for driving me this crazy." His other hand slid up her side, brushing the edge of her ribcage, and he pressed his body against hers, the hard lines of his armor clashing with her softness. Selene's hands gripped his shoulders, her nails scraping through his shirt, and she tilted her head, her lips brushing his in a ghost of a kiss that set his nerves ablaze. "You'd better survive, then," she whispered, her voice shaking with want, and he felt her thighs shift against his, the friction sending a jolt through him. His hand tightened on her waist, pulling her harder against the wall, and he dragged his lips along her jaw, tasting the pulse that raced there. She arched into him, her body yielding just enough to make his head spin, and he wanted nothing more than to rip through the barriers between them. Armor, robe, everything. He pulled back, breathing hard, his eyes locked on hers, burning with a promise he couldn't voice. She stared back, her chest rising and falling fast, and he could see the flush creeping up her neck, the way her hands lingered on him. "Stay sharp out there," she said, her tone steadying, but her fingers stayed curled into his shirt. He nodded, stepping away, though every muscle screamed to pull her back. He grabbed his rifle from the rack, slinging it over his shoulder, and headed for the door, her eyes following him as he moved. The hum of the ship grew louder outside, voices echoing down the corridor, and he glanced back at her, her silhouette still pressed against the wall where he'd left her. Kellan crouched behind a shattered console in the ship's command deck, the air thick with smoke and the acrid sting of burnt metal. Alarms blared, a relentless wail that drowned out the shouts of Selene's loyalists as they clashed with the conservatives' forces. He gripped his rifle, the barrel still warm from the last burst he'd fired, and scanned the chaos. Bodies littered the floor, some human, some alien, all caught in the crossfire of a power struggle that had finally boiled over. The conservatives had struck hard, their sleek drones slicing through defenses, their soldiers moving with cold precision. He'd taken down 3 already, but it wasn't enough, not yet. He spotted Selene across the deck, her figure a blur of crimson as she barked orders, her energy weapon flashing with each shot. She was a force, unyielding even as the odds stacked against her, and Kellan felt a surge of pride mixed with something darker, something that made his hands itch to reach her. A drone swooped low, its beam cutting a line through the floor, and he lunged, tackling a soldier aiming for her back. They hit the ground hard, and he drove his blade into the man's chest, the alien's blood slicking his hands as he rolled off, panting. Selene's eyes met his for a split second, fierce and grateful, before she turned back to the fight. The tide shifted slowly, her forces pushing the conservatives toward the lower decks, but the cost was steep. Kellan's shoulder ached from a glancing blow, his shirt torn and stained, and every breath burned in his lungs. He fired again, dropping another enemy, and the room quieted as the last of the attackers retreated, their footsteps echoing down the corridors. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and saw Selene lower her weapon, her chest heaving as she surveyed the wreckage. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they'd held the line, and that was enough for now. She crossed the deck toward him, her robe streaked with ash, her hair wild from the chaos. He didn't wait for her to speak. He grabbed her, pulling her into a fierce embrace, his arms locking around her like he could shield her from the war still raging beyond these walls. She stumbled against him, her hands clutching his shoulders, and he buried one hand in her hair, fingers tangling in the thick strands as he gripped tight, anchoring her to him. Her scent hit him, smoke and that sharp, wild edge he couldn't get enough of, and he crashed his lips into hers, a kiss that tasted of victory and desperation, all heat and raw need. Selene melted into him, her mouth opening under his, and he pressed harder, his tongue sweeping against hers, claiming her in a way the battlefield never could. His other hand slid to her waist, pulling her flush against him, and he felt the shudder that ran through her, her body soft and trembling beneath the robe. "You're the only prize I want," he rasped against her lips, his voice thick with want, and he tightened his grip in her hair, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss. Her nails dug into his shoulders, sharp and urgent, and he groaned, the sound lost in the heat of her mouth as their breaths mingled, fast and uneven. He pushed her back against the console, the edge digging into her hips, and his hands roamed, sliding down her sides, fingers tracing the curve of her ribs through the thin fabric. She arched into him, her chest pressing against his, and he could feel every inch of her, warm, alive, electric, driving his pulse into a frenzy. His lips left hers, trailing along her jaw to the hollow of her throat, and he nipped at the skin there, tasting the salt and the pulse that raced beneath. She gasped, a low, throaty sound that shot straight through him, and he pressed his body harder against hers, the friction of her thighs against his sending a jolt of heat up his spine. Her hands slid down his chest, tugging at his torn shirt, and he felt the scrape of her nails against his skin, a sting that only fueled the fire. He pulled back just enough to look at her, eyes dark and wild, lips swollen from him, her chest rising and falling fast, and the sight nearly undid him. "We're not done," he said, his voice rough, hands still locked on her hips, thumbs brushing the sensitive dip where her waist flared. She nodded, her breath shaky, and he could see the war still raging in her eyes, the pull between duty and this thing between them. She pushed off the console, stepping out of his grip, and he let her go, though his hands flexed with the urge to pull her back. She moved toward a comm panel on the wall, her fingers trembling slightly as she tapped out a command, her voice steadying as she spoke into it. "Secure the lower decks," she ordered, her tone sharp despite the flush still coloring her neck. Kellan leaned against the console, his heart still pounding, Watching her as she worked, the taste of her lingering on his lips and the echo of her body pressed against his still burning in his mind. Kellan sprinted down the corridor, the ship shaking beneath his feet as explosions rocked its hull. The conservatives had come back with a vengeance, their assault hitting harder than before. Drones buzzing through the air, soldiers breaching every level, their weapons cutting through steel like it was paper. He gripped his rifle, the barrel slick with sweat, and ducked as a blast tore through the wall beside him, showering him with sparks. Selene was ahead, her crimson robe a flash of color in the chaos, leading a handful of loyalists against the tide. He cursed under his breath, pushing forward, his boots pounding the floor as he closed the distance. A drone swooped low, its beams slicing toward her, and Kellan lunged, shoving her out of the way. They hit the ground hard, rolling into a shadowed alcove as the beams scorched the spot where she'd stood. His shoulders screamed from the impact, but he ignored it, pulling her up against the wall, his body shielding hers. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp tang of ozone, and he could hear the shouts of the enemy closing in, their boots echoing like thunder. "Stay down," he growled, peering around the corner, his rifle raised. She grabbed his arm, her grip tight, and he felt her trembling, not from fear, but from the same fire that burned in him. He fired a burst, dropping 2 soldiers as they rounded the bend, their bodies crumpling in a heap. The drone circled back, and he yanked Selene deeper into the alcove, pressing them both against the wall as its sensors whirred past. Her breath was hot against his neck, her chest heaving, and he turned to her, his hands finding her hips in the dark. He pulled her into him, his fingers sliding lower, digging into the soft flesh just below her waist, the thin fabric of her robe bunching under his grip. She shuddered, her body pressing closer, and he could feel every curve, every tremble, as the danger outside roared louder. His hands tightened, possessive and urgent, and he bent down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, the faint hum of her alien scent, wild, sharp, intoxicating, filling his lungs. "If we die here," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "I want to remember how you smell." His fingers pressed harder, sliding along her hips, feeling the heat pouring off her, and he pulled her tighter against him, her thighs brushing his, the friction sending a jolt through his core. She gasped, a soft, desperate sound that hit him like a punch, and he pressed his body closer, the hard lines of his armor clashing with her softness, amplifying the ache that clawed at him. Selene's hands gripped his chest, her nails scraping through his shirt, and she tilted her head, her lips grazing his jaw in a fleeting, electric touch. "Don't you dare die," she whispered, her voice shaky but fierce, and he felt her shift against him, her hips pressing into his with a need that mirrored his own. His hand slid up her side, brushing the edge of her ribcage, and he nipped at her earlobe, a light graze of teeth that made her tremble harder. The heat between them burned, a wildfire stoked by the chaos around them, and he wanted to lose himself in her, to hell with the war outside. The drone's hum grew louder, snapping him back, and he pulled away just enough to raise his rifle, his other hand still locked on her hip. He fired, the shot ringing in his ears as the drone sparked and crashed, its wreckage skidding across the floor. Selene's breath was ragged beside him, her hands still clutching him, and he turned back to her, his eyes dark with the promise of more. "We're not done," he said, his voice rough, thumb brushing the curve of her waist one last time before he let go. She nodded, her gaze steadying, and pushed off the wall, drawing her own weapon from beneath her robe. "Cover me," she said, her tone sharp again, though the flush on her neck betrayed her. He fell in a step beside her, his rifle trained on the corridor as they moved, the sounds of battle growing louder ahead. The alcove faded behind them, but the feel of her, warm, trembling, alive, stayed with him, a fire in his blood as they pressed forward into the fray. Kellan leaned against the wall of the command chamber, his arms crossed, the ache in his shoulder a dull throb as the ship's systems hummed around him. The battle had left scars, on the hull, on the crew, on him, but they'd held the conservatives at bay for now. Selene stood at the center of the room, her crimson robe streaked with dust. Her hands clenched as she faced the holographic display, flickering with reports of the Empire's fracturing edges. Her loyalists watched her, their eyes sharp with expectation, but Kellan could see the strain in her posture, the weight of a choice she hadn't voiced yet. She turned, her gaze finding his, and the air shifted, heavy with something unspoken. "Leave us," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the murmurs of her officers. They hesitated, then filed out, the door sealing shut behind them with a soft hiss. Kellan straightened, his pulse kicking up as she crossed the room, her steps deliberate, her eyes locked on him. "You're hurt," she said, her tone softer now, and he shrugged, ignoring the sting. "Takes more than that to stop me," he replied, his voice rough but steady. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off her, and her hands reached out, hovering over his chest before settling there, firm and warm. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice breaking, and he tensed, searching her face. "The Empire, the control, it's killing me. I want you." The words hit him like a shockwave, raw and unguarded, and before he could respond, she grabbed his shirt, pulling him into a kiss that crashed over him like a storm. Fierce, desperate, all heat and need. He groaned into her mouth, his hands sliding to her waist, fingers slipping under the edge of her robe to find the bare skin beneath. Her flesh was smooth, alien warm, and he gripped her hard, pulling her against him until she was flush with his body, her curves molding to him. His thumbs dug into the soft plane of her stomach, tracing the dip where her waist flared, and she shuddered, her lips parting wider under his. He deepened the kiss, tasting her, salt, fire, everything he'd fought for, and his hands tightened, like he could fuse her into him, make her his in a way no empire could claim. Her nails raked down his chest, a sharp sting through his torn shirt, and he pulled back just enough to speak, his forehead pressed to hers, his breath ragged. "You're choosing me," he rasped, his voice thick with triumph and want, "and I'll make damn sure you don't regret it." His hand slid higher, brushing the underside of her ribs, and she arched into him, her body trembling with surrender. He could feel her heartbeat, fast and wild, against his chest, and his lips found her jaw, trailing down to her throat, nipping at the pulse there until she gasped, a sound that drove him to the edge. Her hands clutched his shoulders, anchoring her, and he pressed her back against the wall, his body pinning hers, the friction of her thighs against his sending a jolt through him. His fingers dug into her skin, possessive and hungry, and he kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the way she yielded, the way she burned for him. She broke away, breathless, her eyes dark and certain, and he saw it, the moment she let go of everything else for him. She stepped out his grip, her chest heaving, and moved to the comm panel, her fingers steady now as she tapped out a command. "Broadcast this," she said into it, her voice clear despite the flush on her skin. "I'm stepping down. The Empire will stand, but not under me." Kellan watched her, his hands still tingling from her, as she turned back to him, her gaze unwavering. Kellan stood on the balcony overlooking the rebuilt plaza, the air cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of weeks past. The Empire was shifting. Selene's abdication had sparked a new order, one without the iron grip of control, and he'd been there every step, helping her carve it out. She stood beside him now, her robe a soft silver that caught the light, her presence a steady hum against his senses. He reached out, his hand brushing her shoulder, and she turned, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that still caught him off guard. He stepped behind her, his hands sliding from her shoulders down her arms, feeling the smooth fabric give way to the heat of her skin. His fingers traced the curve of her waist, pulling her back against him, her body fitting perfectly against his chest. She leaned into him, her head tilting slightly, and he bent down, his lips grazing the nape of her neck, the faint scent of her, sharp, wild, his filling his lungs. "You're mine now," he murmured, his voice a low growl against her skin, "and nothing's going to stop that." His hands tightened on her hips, possessive and sure, and he felt her shiver, a soft tremor that fueled the fire in him. Her hands reached back, gripping his thighs, and he pressed closer, his chest flush against her back, the warmth of her seeping into him. His lips moved along her neck, a slow, deliberate path, and she sighed, a sound that sent a thrill through him. His fingers slid lower, brushing the tops of her hips, and he nipped at her skin, a light graze that made her arch against him, her body alive under his touch. The peace around them only sharpened the heat between them, a quiet claim in a world they'd remade. She turned her head, her lips brushing his jaw, and he felt the pull of her, the need that hadn't faded even with the war behind them. He loosened his grip, letting her turn fully to face him, her hands sliding up his chest as she looked up at him. The plaza stretched out below, voices drifting up from the crowd gathering to see the new dawn, and Kellan pulled her closer, his arm looping around her waist as they stepped toward the railing. Kellan stood in the control hub, the air buzzing with the quiet hum of machinery as the Empire's new framework took shape. Screens flickered with plans, cities rising from rubble, trade routes opening, a society built on freedom instead of chains. He'd spent weeks at Selene's side, hammering out every detail, his hands as callous from work as they'd been from war. She moved beside him now, her silver robe catching the light, her fingers tracing a holographic map with a precision that still awed him. He watched her, the way her hair fell over her shoulder, the quiet strength in her posture, and felt a surge of pride. This was theirs, a world they'd forged together. He stepped closer, his boots silent on the polished floor, and slid his hands onto her hips, pulling her back against him. She didn't flinch, just leaned into his touch, her body warm and familiar under his grip. His fingers splayed over her curves, tracing the smooth lines of her waist through the thin fabric, and he felt her shift, a subtle invitation that sent heat curling through him. "I'm building this empire," he murmured, his voice low and rough against her ear, "but you're the one thing I want to conquer most." His thumbs brushed higher, teasing the dip where her hips flared, and she shivered, a soft tremor that fueled the fire in his veins. Her head tilted, exposing the curve of her neck, and he pressed his lips there, tasting the faint salt of her skin, the wild edge of her scent that never failed to pull him in. His hands tightened, possessive and hungry, sliding along her sides, feeling the give of her flesh beneath the robe. She turned her head slightly, her breath hitching, and he could feel the heat pouring off her, the way her body responded to every touch. "You're distracting me," she said, her voice husky but laced with a smile, and he grinned against her skin, nipping lightly at her earlobe until she gasped, a sound that shot straight through him. "Good," he replied, his hands lingering, thumbs brushing the sensitive skin just above her waistband. "Keeps you on your toes." She laughed, a rare, soft sound that warmed him more than the work ever could, and turned in his arms, her hands resting on his chest. He held her gaze, the air between them thick with everything they'd fought for, and felt the weight of it settle, peace, purpose her. She stepped back, her fingers trailing down his arm as she moved to the console, tapping out a command to adjust the map. "We're almost there," she said, her tone steady now, and he nodded, leaning against the edge of the table, his eyes still fixed on her as she worked, the memory of her heat still pulsing in his hands. Kellan stood with Selene under a sky ablaze with stars, the rebuilt plaza stretching out below them, alive with the hum of a new era. The air was cool, the night vast, and he felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by something solid, something theirs. She stood close, her silver robe shimmering faintly, her presence a quiet fire beside him. He reached for her, his hand finding her waist, and pulled her into him, her body fitting against his like it was made to be there. His fingers tightened, sliding up her back, feeling the warmth of her skin through the fabric, and she leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. He bent down, his lips brushing her temple, and his hands roamed higher, tracing the curve of her spine, the heat of her building under his touch. "I'm never letting you go," he whispered, his voice a deep, steady promise against her skin, and he kissed her, slow, deliberate, a fire that burned without rushing. Her lips parted under his, soft and fierce, and he deepened it, tasting her, feeling her melt into him with a need that matched his own. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her tighter, and he felt her shudder, her body pressing closer, the friction of her hips against his sending a jolt through him. She sighed into his mouth, a sound that drove him wild, and he slid his hands lower, fingers digging into the soft flesh of her hips, possessive and sure. His lips left hers, trailing along her jaw to the hollow of her throat, and he nipped there, a light graze that made her arch against him, her nails scraping his shoulders through his shirt. The heat between them flared, a quiet storm under the stars, and he pressed his body harder against hers, savoring the way she fit, the way she burned for him even now, after everything. Her hand slid up his chest, clutching him, and she pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes dark and endless. "This is our world," she said, her voice soft but certain, and he nodded, his thumb brushing the curve of her cheek. "Ours," he echoed, his tone rough with love, and he kissed her again, slower this time, letting it linger, a seal on everything they'd built. The stars stretched out above, infinite and bright, and he felt her heartbeat against his, steady and strong. They turned together, facing the plaza, her hands slipping into his as the crowd below moved like a living thing, free, alive, a testament to their fight. Kellan squeezed her hand, his other arm looping around her waist, and they stood there, the night wrapping around them, a future unfolding in every breath they shared.